The nightmare. It's the dark whisper in the dead of night, the shadow that creeps into your mind when your guard is down, a twisted reflection of your deepest fears, manifesting in the most vulnerable corner of your consciousness. It's the feeling of being trapped, helpless, and consumed by an unrelenting terror that seeps into your very being. In the realm of nightmares, the lines between reality and madness blur, and the grotesque and the bizarre become your only reality. The darkness closes in, suffocating you with an inescapable sense of dread, as your subconscious unleashes a maelstrom of horrors that defy the light of day. And when you awaken, gasping for air, the memory of the nightmare lingers, a haunting echo that taunts you, reminding you that the terror is always lurking, waiting to strike when you least expect it. But it's only a nightmare, right? Our nightmare couldn't kill us, right? Right? What if I told you there has been reported cases of nightmare syndrome leading to death? Would you believe me? Well, you should, because it's true.
Nightmare on Elm Street came out of a series of articles in the LA Times, if I'm not mistaken, starting in, I would guess, in the late 70s. They were, as I remember, about 3 to 6 months apart, and they were not correlated. That is, the LA Times, for whatever reasons, did not sort of catch that they had had a story about this before. They were all very small, and essentially they would go like, some young man, usually of Southeast Asian origin, had been reported to have died in the middle of a nightmare. And the first two I clipped and kept without thinking too much about it, and then the third one had really the nub of a story in it. And basically this kid, and he had been he and his family had come out of the relocation camps in Southeast Asia, I think Cambodia, something like that. They were now in the United States, living someplace in California. And he had been troubled by severe nightmares. And they had they had increased in intensity to the point where he had told his family, these are not, they don't feel ordinary. And his family had tried to console him and tell him, you know, we've come out of this terrible background. Nightmares are a normal part of your psyche, trying to deal with that. But he increased in the sense of trying to say, this doesn't feel normal, it feels too real. And at a certain point, they had a doctor prescribe sleeping medicine for him, and his father insisted he take it. And it turned out later that he had taken the pills you know, under their supervision, and then as soon as they were aware, he had spit them out. And they also discovered later that he had a coffee pot in his closet that he had kept with black coffee to stay awake at night. So this had gone on. He had decided at a certain point to stay awake and not sleep. And obviously the family thought he was having something like a nervous breakdown. And after about 3 days, he would be downstairs watching television all through the night. They went down and found him asleep on the couch, and the father brought him back to his bed. And the family, sort of felt like, thank God, he seems to be sleeping peacefully. And they all went to bed. And later in the night, they heard screaming and thrashing about. They ran into his room. And before they could get to him, he fell dead, stone dead. And the family had had an autopsy done, and there was no heart failure. There was no sign of why he had died. That was a story. It was about a 10-inch story instead of the others were 3 or 4-inch stories. And I just read that. I said, this is like, it just evoked something very deep in me.
Numerous articles have been published about nightmare death syndrome. The New York Times, 1975. Nightmare syndrome linked to sudden death. The Washington Post, 1980. Nightmare syndrome blamed for soldier's death. Time Magazine, 1982. The Nightmare Death Syndrome. Science News, 1985. Nightmares and sudden death, a possible link. And that's just to name a few articles. From 1981 to 1988, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention reported 117 cases among Southeast Asian refugees in the United States. This bizarre disorder peaked between 1981 and 1982 as poor souls cried out in their sleep before suddenly dying. The CDC investigated this at great length. However, the wave of deaths among the Southeast Asians, particularly the Hmong group, it's still unexplained. Nightmare death syndrome, also known as sudden unexpected nocturnal death syndrome, has been linked to specific medical conditions, including Brugada syndrome, a genetic disorder affecting the heart's electrical system, leading to abnormal heart rhythms during sleep, and sudden arrhythmic death syndrome, a broader category of sudden unexpected deaths due to cardiac arrhythmias during sleep. Research suggests that many cases of nightmare death syndrome are associated with these underlying cardiac conditions, particularly Brugada syndrome. The syndrome predominantly affects Southeast Asians, the young adults. While the exact mechanism is not fully understood, it's believed that intense fear or stress from a nightmare can trigger a fatal arrhythmia in individuals with these underlying heart conditions. As I mentioned earlier, despite exhaustive investigation by the CDC, the deaths among the young Southeast Asians remains unexplained, leaving many questions unanswered. The medical explanations for nightmare death syndrome, including Brugada syndrome and sudden arrhythmic death syndrome, shed light on explanations, but also opens the door to another question. Is there a supernatural component equally worth considering? What triggers the terror that awakens the heart's deadly arrhythmia? The unusual circumstances surrounding these deaths also raise more questions than answers and can lead you down to many rabbit holes. The victims, all young and healthy refugees from the Hmong tribe in Laos, died suddenly between midnight and 4 a.m., with witnesses reporting that they were in the middle of a nightmare. The lone female victim and all male victims shared a common background, having been displaced from their homeland and separated from their traditional religious rites and practices? Was their deaths the result of a dark placebo effect, where fear and stress became self-fulfilling prophecies? Or was something wickedly supernatural at play? The Hmong people believed that evil spirits and demons haunted them, exploiting their vulnerability due to the lack of access to their proactive religious rites and traditions. Did the Hmong refugees subconsciously scare themselves to death? Or was it the absence of their spiritual safeguards that allowed these dark entities to claim their lives? The uncertainty surrounding nightmare death syndrome leaves us wondering if the line between medical explanation and supernatural terror is blurred beyond recognition. Is nightmare death syndrome simply a tragic consequence of our own conscious fears? Or is it something far more sinister? Is it the darkness within our own minds, or the whispered presence of a supernatural entity lurking in the shadows? Does the darkness that claims lives in the dead of night have a name, a face, or evil intent? Or is it just the devastating culmination of our own deepest terrors? The answer, much like the darkness, remains elusive. But one thing's certain: the line between reality and nightmare is thin, and the darkness is always waiting to embrace us. Thanks for tuning in to this Burn After Reading Halloween special. Until next time, perhaps you should take Nancy's advice.
Whatever you do, don't fall asleep.
Burn the lies, burn the fear inside myself, and burn it all again. It's the right time to escape.